Hi, I'm Iain Simpson. I'm a commercial director at Phillips Medisize. And in this presentation, I'm going to talk about medication and particularly about the role of connected devices in improving medication adherence. I'm going to talk a little bit about the problem around medication non-adherence, and then I'm going to focus around clinical trials and why medication adherence is important to consider in trials. I'll introduce the idea of connected devices, and then I'll finish with some conclusions, again, mainly around clinical trials. So medication adherence, as many of you will know, is a significant problem within the healthcare system. You can see from the data here that it accounts for a large number of deaths, a significant number of hospitalizations, and a large add-on to the healthcare bill, just looking at the US alone before you even look globally. It also impacts pharmaceutical company revenues as well. And you can see here from the data that there's a significant amount of revenue loss due to medication non-adherence. The problem is that medication adherence is a difficult thing to support because non-adherence is caused by many different factors. The graphic on the left is a graphic from the World Health Organization paper from 2003, and it shows the factors that contribute to medication non-adherence. Some relate to the patient, some relate to the disease, some relate to the treatment and the side effects of the treatment, and some are more about the healthcare system or the socioeconomic factors such as affordability of medicines and those sorts of things. So the problem is you've got many conflicting factors that determine whether somebody will be adherent with the medication or not. One of the good news with regard to connected health is we know that connectivity supports us in many aspects of our life, and we know that connected systems can provide a personalized and cost-effective approach to supporting many things we do in daily life. And that's no different in healthcare. You know, I'm a great believer that that connected health can contribute a lot to better healthcare systems and improve efficiency and patient outcomes and patient engagement. But there's a lot of work to do to get there. If we focus upon medication adherence, it's an important element in understanding how healthcare treatments work. Obviously, a lot of interest within healthcare is around measuring outcomes. Those are the things that the reimbursement is directed around. Of course, those are things that matter to patients being treated. But adherence, of course, is an important element in determining effective outcomes. And you can see that in the chart here, the simple 4x4 matrix, that you've got adherence in one dimension and you've got whether somebody has a positive response to a drug treatment or not. And you can divide that into 4 quadrants. And of course, where we want to be is in the upper right-hand quadrant. The patient's adherent to the medicine and the medicine is also effective in terms of treating their disease. That's ideal. The bottom left-hand corner, of course, is somewhat futile. The drug doesn't work and the patient's not taking it. So we have a problem there on both accounts. What's more interesting in this diagram is the 2 other sectors here, because we want to be able to differentiate between patients that are non-adherent and patients that are non-responding to a treatment. Because if we know what the problem is, then we can deal with it in the right way. If they're non-adherent, we can improve the adherence. But if they're a non-responder, we can recognize that they need to move on to some other form of treatment. And the quotes on the right-hand side from a couple of research papers just support the situation. If you look at severe asthma, which is a particular part of the asthma disease world, probably half the people who are diagnosed with severe asthma are really non-adherent to existing treatments rather than necessarily needing a new drug. And then if we look on the other side of that in terms of response, it's reckoned that in the treatment of Crohn's disease with TNF-alpha inhibitors, which are very effective drugs for many autoimmune diseases, but probably 20 to 30% of people don't give a good response to that treatment for Crohn's disease. So it's really important to separate those 2 factors out and understand how we build that into treatment pathways. If we now turn to clinical trials then, clinical trials can overcome many of the problems that you see in the real world that cause non-adherence. For example, they use exclusion criteria to avoid patients with complex comorbidities or other medical complications. They don't have the financial problems that might be associated with affordability of medicines in the real world. But they still face challenges. For example, some data from a meta-study of a number of clinical trials showed a significant loss of patients over the duration of a trial, through non-adherence, and also showed that even patients who stayed within the study still had days where they didn't take their medication correctly. And then finally, of course, with regard to clinical trials, it's important that we align the outcome of the clinical trial to real-world expectations. There's no point having clinical data that doesn't reflect what's going to happen in the real world. So it's important to tie those two bits of information together. And poor adherence can impact clinical trials in two main ways. It can lead to an underestimation of efficacy and safety of a drug, because if patients who we thought had taken the medication, the trial actually haven't, we can conclude that we need a higher dose to actually be effective and set a higher average dose for the commercial product, which then might mean that people who are adherent could be overdosing on the drug and could have consequences from that. And then the second aspect around clinical trials is a loss of statistical power. If people are non-adherent and not taking their medicine, you're going to need a larger study to get a result from that. And that can add to time and cost in a clinical trial, as we'll see on the next slide. And surprisingly, despite these considerations, there is no requirement from the FDA or the EMA to measure and report adherence levels in clinical trials. I find that somewhat surprising and something that really should be changed in the industry. So just to show some data around that, then the graph on the left is in fact a graph showing the results I described briefly in the previous slide. You can see in this meta-analysis, then you can see the 40% fall off in patients remaining in the study over a year or so that the study period ran for. That's the blue line in the graph. And then the red line below that is showing the difference, because people who stay in the study are still not always taking their medication on the days they're supposed to. So you can see a gap between those two, which is the 12% we talked about in the last slide. And then on the right-hand side, there's some data that's here reproduced from an online report looking at the cost of non-adherence within clinical trials. And in this study, they looked at how much trials cost per patient, the typical size of trials. And then they looked at, if you assumed a 40% adherence rate, and then that fell down to 39%, what would that mean in terms of cost? And you can see there's some quite significant numbers there, depending on the trial size. So there's certainly money that can be saved and gained by managing adherence better within clinical trials. There are a number of different ways of measuring medication adherence, and they all have pros and cons associated with them. The gold standard is direct analyte measurements. This is where you're actually measuring how much drug is in the bloodstream. But that's not really very practical in many situations. It may be okay in a clinical trial, and it's okay when you're monitoring professional athletes to see whether they've been taking prohibited drugs or not. But it's not going to be useful in mainstream healthcare. What is commonly used within mainstream healthcare is the use of database analysis. If you know that somebody's been prescribed medicine, you know that they've actually collected that medicine from the pharmacy, you can then infer their usage. You know that they're coming back to refill their prescription, that they're still staying persistent on their medicine. But the challenge is you don't know actually when they're taking the medicine. You don't know whether they're stockpiling medicine at home or throwing medicine away. You don't get any information about that. If you use electronic monitoring, you can gather accurate data when somebody has actually used their medication. And this is commonly done, or quite commonly done, in clinical trials using smart packaging or pill dispensers that record when somebody has opened the device and taken medicine out of that. But again, you don't necessarily know whether the person's taken the medicine or not. You can, of course, count pills. You can work out, you can see how many pills somebody's been given either in a trial or in the real world. You can see when they come back to the pharmacy if they've got any pills left. You can infer from that, again, how much medicine they might have used, but you don't know what's happened to it. And then finally, you can do clinician assessment. You can ask somebody how adherent they've been, but of course they might remember or they may not choose to tell the truth. So none of the solutions at the moment are perfect in terms of what they can do. But we have an opportunity there with connected devices. We already know there are a lot of connected devices being used in commercial drug use. We've seen smart auto-injectors, we've seen smart inhaler devices and add-ons for insulin pens. And although still not that common in use, uptake is increasing, and we're starting to see evidence that these things work quite well. And then on the clinical trial side of things, we've also seen devices designed for clinical studies. So Ardex has done an awful lot of work in this area, using smart pill dispensers and smart tablet dispensers. And Cton Dickinson have recently produced some results from a trial looking at a smart syringe that they've used in clinical studies, and they look to take forward into further studies. So the point here is connected devices can actually span both clinical trials and commercial situations and provide accurate and timely data about when medication is being used. And just to give a bit more details about the work that Cton Dickinson's been doing, this is some results that were recently published in a journal in non-drug delivery. And you can see the system involved a connected pre-filled syringe connected to a smartphone, and the smartphone then sent that data into a data cloud, and then that data cloud could be shared with other data clouds, for instance, to put that information into a healthcare record. And a study was done with around about 23 patients and healthcare professionals who were asked to perform simulated injections using the smart syringe. And the success of those injections was monitored, and also patient feedback was gathered in terms of the usability of the system. And as you can see from the data on the right, of the 148 planned injections, 146 were actually correctly captured. And you can see pretty good feedback in terms of patients would have got their medication as a simulated use, and also they're very satisfied that the system was quite easy to use. So a really good example of what can be done within a clinical environment. And then, of course, potentially that technology and knowledge can be taken forward into commercial use as well. So just to conclude on what I've presented today, medication adherence should be adopted as a critical measurement within clinical trials. In early trials, it's important that we take adherence into account to estimate optimal dosing that's required for efficacious and safe drug medication delivery. And in late stage trials, it's important to understand what real world adherence might look like, and how we can support that. And perhaps importantly, in late stage trials, using connected health systems and other interventions, we can try and improve adherence, because that's what we really like to achieve, not just measure, but actually to improve. If adherence is measured in both clinical trials and in the real world, then we can correlate between the two, and we can ensure that the clinical data represents what's happening in the real world. And likewise, if we see poor performance of drug in the real world, we can try and understand what that means, and then obviously develop interventions that will improve the use of that medication, maybe based upon what we've learned in the clinical trials. Connected devices can gather accurate and timely medication data, and that can be used, first of all, as a means to gather accurate data for analysis and for study. But of course, it can also provide the basis for targeted interventions to support improved medication adherence and improve healthcare outcomes. Thank you very much for your time in listening to this talk. I hope you found it useful, and I look forward to continuing discussion with some of you.